Bonjour à tous, je vois qu'on est très très nombreux ici. Bravo au Cercle des économistes, bravo à Jean-Hervé Lorenzi. Il faut dire qu'il y a beaucoup de questions. Là, on va s'intéresser à un sujet, l'économie face aux ruptures. Ne vous inquiétez pas, on ne va pas parler de rupture politique, même si c'est un peu le sujet qu'on a tous dans nos têtes. On va parler de cette fin de la mondialisation telle qu'on l'a connue. En tous les cas, c'est ce que peut-être vont arguer certains. Les ruptures que nous devons affronter, que vous devez affronter, que l'Europe doit affronter, que la Chine doit affronter, que l'Afrique doit affronter, que la Finlande doit affronter. Si je dis ça, c'est parce que vraiment, nous avons autour de cette table ronde, tous les 3 continents, en tous les cas, sont représentés. Je dirais qu'il manque peut-être les États-Unis, Jean-Hervé Lorenzi, ça sera pour la prochaine fois, il faut dire qu'eux aussi, ils sont occupés. Alors, rapidement, je crois que vous les connaissez quasiment tous, en tous les cas, celui qui va coordonner cette table ronde, Philippe Aguillon, professeur au Collège de France. J'en profite pour faire un peu de pub pour vous, Philippe. Votre livre sur l'IA, Notre ambition pour la France, que vous avez coécrit avec Anne Bouvreau, puisque vous avez présidé la commission pour l'intelligence artificielle, voir qu'est-ce qu'il fallait faire. J'ai envie de dire peut-être que votre rapport, il est un peu dans un placard pour l'instant, mais vous nous direz peut-être qu'on pourra le ressortir après les élections. C'est sûr que ça brouille. Et vous faites une dédicace, Philippe, je crois. À quelle heure? Vous pouvez nous le dire? Juste après, voilà. Donc si vous voulez son livre. À côté de vous, c'est Enrico Letta, ancien Premier ministre italien, qui vient de remettre un rapport qui a été très plébiscité, là aussi, à l'Union européenne, sur comment on devait transformer l'Europe, comment l'Europe pouvait éviter le décrochage européen. C'est un point aussi essentiel avec ce nouveau Parlement européen, cette nouvelle Commission européenne. À ses côtés, alors je fais très attention parce que on m'a mis quand même des personnalités très impressionnantes, mais qui ont tous des noms un peu compliqués, donc je vais tout faire pour pas essayer d'écorcher votre nom. Miepatra Kumpula-Natri, qui est députée, qui est au Parlement européen, qui est finlandaise, et ce qui est très intéressant...
From Finland, and of course Finland is very close to Russia, and she is in the Commission of Sanctions vis-à-vis against Russia, and she will tell us about the evolution and the ruptures. Next to him, Pierre Doquès, an economist professor, who will tell us that this is the end of globalization, happy globalization. Next to him, Lin Kun-jin from Beijing, Vice President of the Infrastructure Asian Bank, a key individual in the Chinese government. He was Vice Minister of Finance, and he will tell us, the new Silk Road, is important, and especially when it comes to Southeast Asia. Then next to me, Kako Numbuko, you know him, he's an economist. We know him at the Rencontre d'Aix, Africa, of course, and he was telling me, if I take me as the last speaker, well, between the Chinese and European pressure, what of Africa. So now, Philippe Aguillon, what ruptures have to be faced? Thank you. France, as you know, there is a major election in France next weekend that will define its future quite in a durable way, and its role in the world, in Europe, and whereas the world faces technological revolution, climate change, faces the problem of a war, there is war in Europe now. Those are the main challenges, and what will happen in 2 days will determine whether or not France can play its role. So it's quite a dramatic aspect of French history. So let's talk about the French and European loss. France is behind in the high-tech technology and in the rupture innovation versus the US, and now even versus China. China is getting the better, and the growth of our productivity drops versus that of the US. Why? Well, a recent study published by the Bocconi University, Jean Tirolese, who played a key role in this study. So I didn't know, Jean, that you'd be attending the meeting. Jean should be sitting here, actually, so that puts a bit of pressure, yes, indeed. So the study from the Bocconi University. Jean played a role there, as played a key role. There is a striking aspect. The high-tech industries, the software, IT, the biotech and pharmaceutical world represent 85% of the R&D private expenditures in the US, whereas the automotive industry absorbs more than 50% of the private R&D expenditures in Europe. Therefore, the US are leading when it comes to high-tech patent, IT, biotech, pharmaceuticals, whereas Europe is a leader in patents, in more traditional patents in transport and mobility. The US have an innovation ecosystem which is much better than ours. It gives us room to fundamental research. They've got great universities, labs, foundations for research, fundamental research. The capital risk system, which finances startups, institutional investors, mutual funds, which will finance innovation in large corporations. They have a major network, and we have nothing of that of the sort in Europe. And they also have a major tool for industrial policy, which even contribute further to guaranteeing their leadership in IT and biotech technology. It is the Advanced Research Project Agency. And the first was, it's called the Defense Research Project Agency, DARPA. It was founded in 1958 during the Cold War to deal with the competition with the Soviet Union for space and defense. And the DARPA program means that they were able to send men to space, went to the moon, and they all created internet and GPS. They had the ARPA Energy and the BARDA, where we had the development of vaccine. This was possible only to the BARDA, which is that for biotechs. There is also the Horizon Europe program, which could change the situation when it comes to rupture innovations. But as the Bocconi report says, 11 billion euro of annual budget, only 1.4 billion euro are assigned, dedicated to the innovation European Innovation Council for rupture industry, but it's not a DARPA, as the report says. Especially, it is submitted to the control of the European Agency for SMEs, and they want to support European SMEs. I love SMEs, but existing SMEs focus more on less breakthrough innovation, what you call the incremental innovation, but not breakthrough or rupture innovation. So Europe is not armed like the US or even like China is when it comes to see, if we pay attention to France when it comes to innovation policies, there were two policies under President Sarkozy. First, the tax research credits, 2 to 6 billion euros. Then there was the creation of the LabEx, Laboratory of Excellence, which receives specific means to attract the best researchers. What was the impact of the two initiatives? Well, a recent study has shown an amazing efficacy of the LabEx. The study shows that the creation of such research and excellency laboratory stimulated rupture innovation and the R&D in the leading industries close to the LabEx. However, the research tax credit, but there was no proven demonstrated effect. So what are the lessons there? Well, for innovation policies which are not targeted do not generate rupture innovation. This also applies for the tax credits, or for the European system I talked about. And the second is that rupture innovation rupture starts with fundamental research, and we need LabEx, we need fundamental research, we need risk capital, institutional investors, we need the true DARPAs. And when we have to deal with China and the US, which have very aggressive innovation policies, France and Europe have to react, rethink Maastricht, rethink the articulation between competition policy and industrial policies, gives more freedom to member states to create an integrated European market with a banking union and a capital union. My fear is we got great researchers, we got great engineers, we got great IT specialists, but when we see the US or China with very aggressive innovation, Europe remains a regulatory giant. Europe will decline. And the drama in France is that in 2 days we might actually decline even more if we make the wrong choice. Well, Enrico Letta will explain to us that in his report he answers all what is lagging in France or in Europe, because the landscape you described is rather scary. Enrico Letta, you published in April, issued a report on the Europe competitiveness, how to boost the inner market with leading sectors, energy, telcos. But what do you say about the objective or rupture innovation? First, I'm very happy to be here. I will with a note of sadness. Last time I was here with Philippe Martin, great friend, great friend of the Cercle, of the Rencontre d'Aix. So I'm somewhat sad to be here without him today. I will start with basic examples. So why Philippe said is true and impacts our lives every day. The report I was asked to write at the European level is a report which asked me to cover the entire Europe. I discussed it with Jean Hervé when we met recently. I told him the story, which actually explains why Europe is lagging behind. We are there with national flags. We did not understand that national flags are too small in today's world, in which China, India, together, when we built this single market, were the 4% of the global economy. Today, they're 25% of the global economy. And we're still here with our national flags. An example, I decided to write the report while visiting the 27 countries, to write in my own country, to visit my country, and I hope you will do it during your holidays. Come to Italy to spend your holidays. You do it with the high-speed train, the Frecciolosa. For 8 years I lived in France. I traveled in France with the TGV. In Spain, same thing. In Germany, the same thing. I thought, okay, I'm going to go around Europe with the high-speed train. So, with the smallest continent in the world, we decided to become green. So, high-speed train. Well, it's impossible to travel in Europe by connecting the European capital cities with high-speed train. Why? Because each country has developed a domestic railway, high-speed railway system, and the high-speed rail track stops at the border, only Paris, Brussels. This is an example of what it means to have a fragmentation which prevents European competitiveness, because something for energy, something for telcos, and for the rest, and especially for financial services, because we all have our flag, national flag, and what's the impact of national flags on our French financial market? We don't have a large European financial market, and therefore, this is great for Wall Street and for the Chinese. And of course, innovation and rupture. What can we do when it comes to investment, when it comes to risk-taking, when investment risk-taking need to immediately to have a financial market which is able to do that, which is not the case in Europe. We got a financial market which is highly fragmented. So first purpose of my report is to explain that I wrote a roadmap in which I say we have to get to a tonic market for financial service, unique, but with one change, and this is the little proposal I will make to the Prime Minister, or to the Prime Minister who will come out on Monday, and I hope will be someone who will deal with such topics. Key question, why haven't we achieved a European financial service market? Well, simple. because in order to integrate, you have to overcome obstacles because inertia goes to national, domestic issues, and we didn't do it for a very basic reason. And the simple reason is as follows. The financial market needs a push, to get together, and this push to get together at the European level needs political leadership. Someone who will say, we need to have European financial markets. But find me one political leader today who's able to put his face next to a proposal for the integration of financial markets. People think, well, that's not for me, that's for the bankers. That brings me nothing. What's in it for me, to have integrated financial markets? What's the key point? We have to do the integration of capital markets to be able to finance green transition and digital, which is the true topic. So the proposal I'm making, so we have to integrate markets, and the possibility to have money, private money. Why? Because private money, goes to the US. And the crazy thing is that the US integrated market is attracting our savings, which will feed and reinforce American companies, which come back to Europe with our money to buy our European companies. So, Edwige, this is a European suicide. This was the integration of the European market. I'll close on that note. Is fundamental to give strength to Europe to overcome this with the risk-taking, which is absolute essential element of innovation. So my report, I really hope that this report, unfortunately, like reports, I hope it will not end up in a drawer or, stacking dust. I want this report to have a true life in Europe. So now we need to convince the public opinions, which is often the problem. Now, I know a lot of people here are convinced, but in the general public, might not be the case. Now, Petra Kumpula-Natri, you're from Finland, you're a social democrat, you part of this commission on the sanction against Russia, the rupture. You experienced them in the European Parliament and, of course, in Finland because of this war with Ukraine, with all the consequences for our soul and for our country.
So thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, I have been working this mandate 10 years in the European Parliament for digital and energy, so the twin transition. And it was then not asked, but we have to start work on the war. And I did not want to say aloud that it is war economy that is challenging us from the neighbor Russia, but we have to act. When I talk to economists, I must ask, what is the price for plan B? There's no plan B, that Ukraine would lose the war. That would change even more. Our security has been changed already. We cannot trust the international orders. We cannot trust the international agreements we had after Russia attacked Ukraine brutally. And it should be on everyday news, because its killing of the civilians is continuing. So in economical terms, where you have here so many people with the highest possible knowledge, the plan B is more costly. So also, what is the public good? What we should finance together with the public money? Can there be any euro better spent than support Ukraine today? Because if not, there will be a lot of insecurities on the border, and the border is European Union. So I hope this is not challenged after the new political leadership in different countries and in Europe is taking place. So then we can see that the sanctions we have been delivering, are they good or bad? Without sanction, situation would be much worse. Even Russian economy, we see that it is growing. It would grow 5% more without sanction. They would have more easy access for battlefield goods. But we have to do that work daily. As the special envoy David O'Sullivan says, that in Kreml they are recruiting more people to circumvent the sanctions. So have to we do the very same. We have to make it more difficult. We have to find new companies in African countries, in Asia, in everywhere, to see that this is not possible. So we are also building up our own defense as an industrial policy, but also it's stupid at the same time to finance the other way. So this is the economical question as everything. So then a few other topics, very short. I think also where we need each other, security being first, climate is the issue not taking away from the table. And this twin transition, digitalization and climate, is not ready after 5 years of the von der Leyen's commission. It's not ready yet. We have to continue. And there is a political challenge. So many politicians saying that, oh, my citizens cannot pay for the renewable energy or so. But there is one concrete hint I had from Finland. The Confederation of Industries published an open list of the intentions of the green investments. And we are a country of 5.5 million. And the intentions of the companies on the green investments is 268 billion. About 100 billion is for the sea wind. And I see the France is doing very much the same. So this made it political challenger be quiet, because they don't want to say no for the planned investment. So I think this is needed everywhere, that you see the industry is ready to move. Or have you seen somewhere a company publishing an advertisement, my company will not cut emission, it will be as dirty as it was 10 years ago? I haven't seen those companies. So I understand the business life understands the climate change. So have to politicians, and not shake, but give the stability of the European tools on the ETS and others. So there also we need global cooperation and look at. So I just mentioned also, being a member of the trade committee, that we have new trade deals. We are very much committed on the international organizations for trade and others, but looking also global gateway to Africa to find more companions, and with the Asian countries to try to do bilateral when what WTO is not working. And finally, for the digital, it was very good to shake the thoughts that why Europe is lacking behind, why only 2 AI companies among the 100 biggest ones. But we have more startups than the United States, we have a lot of innovations, and we should have the digital single market as we have single market working for us. I was a little bit disappointed when we see that we have this recovery fund, 750 billion euros. And I could not believe before that 20% has to be invested on digital. Where are the results? It was nitty-gritty. Every country did some digitalization alone. Finland, we digitalized our railways. At the same time, we are a leading company on the quantum. But we did the normal digitalization. We should put our heads together to look for the digitalization that is strategical, and look also for the broader European ways to do that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Mietratra.
Now, just a point to react to what Philippe Ayon said earlier on. Europe is regulation before innovation. Do you agree with that? Okay. Europe is regulation before innovation. Do you agree or not?
Regulation. Yes, Oloda, yes.
Regulatory giant, budgetary dwarf.
Yes, it is very much true. I'm more on the line of the Anu Bradford, who said that the European way is to make the Brussels effect. Once we did the privacy, there is privacy laws coming in other countries, there's other like that.
That's true.
Yes, there is too much bureaucracy in Europe, that I don't like. But then I like very much regulation that says that privacy needs to be respected, children online needs to be respected. So I don't ask the big companies to tell me how to regulate. Oil companies never came to politicians and said, please regulate us. So neither does the big tech. But then we have to give the rules framework, a little bit less bureaucracy, but the clear rules where we want to say, and then do it together. I visited California many, many times. They are trying to do the regulation. So this is not black or white.
Okay, thanks a lot. Vous êtes économiste.
So, Pierre Decès, you're an economist. Everybody here knows you. Globalization, as we've known it, is over. So, do we need to find a new economic model? Is it going to be protectionism? We really don't know. But what do we need to? How can we be protected from our Chinese friends in particular? Yeah, I would like to start with my conclusion. We really never know. So my conclusion comes from Albert Camus, who said that all previous generations had the goal of making the world new again. And he said that for our generation, the world, our objective is to ensure that the world doesn't come apart. I think, however, there is one distinction we need to draw with what Camus said. In order to avoid it coming apart, I think we need to make the world new again, together. That's in terms of disruptions. And then the general theme of our session is about bringing worlds together, reconciling the world. And since we're economists, of course, we're thinking about the exchange of goods, services, capital, but also, of course, the mobility of people, of information. So we're thinking about trade or commerce, as we talked about in the 18th century, in the broadest sense. So this makes me think about this theme of Montesquieu that was picked up again by others, which had talked about soft trade, gentle trade. What did Montesquieu mean by that? It was two fundamental things. First of all, it was about the fact that when merchants, men and women, travel around the world, they build relationships. And these are relationships that allow them to get to know each other better. And he concluded that as we would get to know each other better, wars would disappear and conflict would disappear. Well, that was 18th century utopianism, because we have to recognize today that people traveled, but they traveled with soldiers, with priests, and that was not always well appreciated by the rest of the world. So it's not just that it's not just through traveling that we can make wars disappear. But the second idea, which was even more important, was the idea which said that through trade and through commercial interests, which were considered to be a good passion, it was thought that this good passion would dominate over poor passions, which were obviously the desire for war. Once again, there's something utopian here, because in order for interest to dominate bad and evil passions, and we can see today how much evil passions are being unleashed out of France, around the world, and in France. In order for the good interests to dominate, they have to be shared. And so that brings us to globalization. Globalization, we've talked about happy globalization. It's true that for a lot of the planet, a lot of human beings have managed to raise themselves up out of extreme poverty. Countries have developed, but everybody knows there have been losers. There have been countries, regions, sectors through deindustrialization, massive deindustrialization. There are social categories that have lost out. And 25 years ago already, Danny Rodrigue was saying it already, globalization has gone too far. He was saying this 25 years ago, which is really quite remarkable when you think about. We couldn't yet see it very clearly at that time, but today it's undeniable that the accentuation of this sense of loss, not just actual losses, but a sense, an acute sense of loss, this has very dangerous consequences. There was a debate between Danny Rodrigue and Paul Krugman, because Paul Krugman, when he read Rodrigue's book with this idea that globalization had gone too far and that we had to slow things down a little bit and do some smart protectionism, Krugman wrote a letter to him and said, "You are giving weapons to the barbarians." Who did he mean by the barbarians? Well, he meant those nationalistic populists, the right or the far right. Well, it is undeniable when we can see how the world has changed in the US and elsewhere. The barbarians have really developed and grown in strength. I'm just coming to the end here. Let me wrap up with the barbarians. But what were the weapons? What was really the weapon that was being given to these barbarians? Well, it was really the fact that globalization was going too far. It was really that fact. Extreme globalization had dangerous consequences, harmful, deathly consequences for many countries and social categories, which allowed the barbarians to come to the fore. So if we need to ensure that the world doesn't fall apart, but yes, we need to do some remaking of the world as well, nevertheless. I just really want to respond here very quickly. Globalization has nevertheless reduced inequalities across the world in a general sense. Studies have shown this between countries, but within countries it's created inequalities. So there are some countries like Scandinavian countries who've put in place social systems, flexi-security systems that have made it possible for those who lose out in the context of globalization are compensated in some way. So they managed to compensate for these inequalities that are created within countries. And I think populism has emerged in countries like England and the US, where social policies have not been put in place in order to adapt to globalization. That was just a debate that I wanted to open up. Of course, I really don't agree with that, but there we go. So I suggest we have a coffee and chat about this later, because otherwise we could go on for some time. So thank you, Lee Kun-jin, for being with us now. You are a very important personality. You're leading the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which of course is focused on developing infrastructure in Southeast Asia, and Western countries such as France are taking part with this. I'm going to be quite direct here, but just to come back to what Pierre Dockès has just been saying, are you the barbarians of globalization? Pardonnez-moi la question.
Je vais parler anglais.
I'm going to be speaking English because I don't speak very good French.
Honor and pleasure to be invited to attend les rencontres économiques in Aix-en-Provence. I would like to share with you my observations, including globalization, on some of the main themes of this conference. I like the idea of relier le monde, connecting the world, or to be exact, connecting the different parts of the world. The last few years have been characterized by multiple interlocking crises, growing geopolitical tensions, ongoing supply chain disruptions, record high interest rates, asynchronized growth, deadly conflicts in some war zones, and their impact on the regional global economies, last but not least, increasingly catastrophic effects of climate change, to just name a few. A most noticeable and worrisome phenomenon in the present-day world is disruption, a febrile backlash against global economic integration. Global economic integration certainly has its side effects, which should not be ignored, but rather must be dealt with. But rejecting economic integration will give rise to economic woes for many countries, including developed countries. Recent years have seen the rampant efforts to push the decoupling and worsening protectionism, which threaten the recovery of many economies from the COVID-19 pandemic and economic slowdown. Not to reverse the trend will keep the global economy further down the road of fragmentation. Disruption by COVID-19 and other natural disasters are temporary. These temporary disruptions by force majeure should not be invited to be here to stay by intentional efforts to render the disruption of global production chain permanent. I think this is my very clear message. Now, we know the so-called beggar thy neighbor policy. In China, we have a saying, watch the fire raging across the river, because the fire is across the river. So at the end of the day, you see the town across the river is completely burned down, ruined. You may lose fierce competitors, but you lose a great market. You find you cannot sell anything across the river because there was no economy whatsoever over there. So beggar thy neighbor policy is no good. Watching the fire raging across the river without offering a helping hand is bad also. So different economies enjoy comparative different advantages. Advantages can only be maintained or even further enhanced by having your advantage subject to fair competition. I highlight fair competition. To safeguard an economist's advantage by isolating it from the rest of the world can produce the very opposite result. However, it's not just protectionism and rejection of foreign direct investment that have to be dealt with. More importantly, major economies, advanced economies, and emerging market economies in particular need to sit down together to strengthen economic cooperation. In the run-up to the WTO membership in 2000, we in China had huge debate. The wolf is coming. All the financial institutions will be wiped out by these fiercely competitive Western financial institutions. Our automobile industry would be completely wiped out, to say nothing of other consumer goods. What's the result? I think the other side is very much worried about the fierce competitiveness of the Chinese manufacturers. This is the reality. You have to live with reality. So my view is we need to work together. The global economy needs cooperation and coordination on a global scale. Just take a look at the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis in Eastern Asian countries. Those countries were told to deal with this crisis yourself. What happened? Later on, when the contagion effect of Asian financial crisis spread to European countries, to North America, and the people start to say, hey, this is not local problem, we have to deal with it. Again, in 2008-2009 global financial crisis originating in the subprime mortgage meltdown in the United States. And then quickly, it became a global crisis. So I think if there are some crises, don't think this is a fire across the street. Nip it in the bud, working together to prevent a more catastrophic disaster. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I do just have one question. Enrico, I'd love to hear your response to what's been just said, particularly in terms of the automotive industry. It's interesting to hear this perspective from Li Keqian. I think that what we've heard is really very important, and I think a lot of things are really true there, but I'd really like to respond just to communicate a European message. We, the Europeans, we like to make sure that we want to make sure that China remains a fundamental economic and political partner. This is really important for the future. What we have not understood and what I want to communicate is that it is impossible for us not to take a position on a key position, which is a key position for us, which is what Russia has done in Europe. If Russia does what it's done in Ukraine, that gives the idea that we can move borders with tanks. That's what happened during the 20th century, and that was a disaster for humanity in Europe. What we're asking is that our Chinese friends might understand that protecting and acting against this Russian attitude with regard to Ukraine it is very hard for us to understand, because we are experiencing something in Europe. You cannot take borders down with tanks. That's something that's so fundamental for us. Thank you, Enrico.
President China in this conference. I'm the president of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The message I would like to give you is that AIIB has extensive cooperation with the European countries. All of the Western European countries are our members, and we've been working very well. I think this is a very important platform for China as the major shareholder to work with the European countries to work out some of the differences. Thank you very much.
C'est ce qui s'appelle.
That is what you call avoiding the question in French. So now we're going to talk about a continent that has not been forgotten, even though you might think so. Kako Mbuko, you're from Togo. You're a senior economist. You're an ex-commissioner. You asked me to mention that. When we talk about the disruptions that we're going through in this confrontation between these three blocks with two key blocks, and then there's this African bloc, which sometimes gets forgotten, I guess. Yes, when I was following this interesting exchange just a few seconds ago, I was thinking about an African proverb that says that when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets the consequences. And the grass, well, it's Africa. So why was I saying that I should have spoken first? Is because Africa is 1.3 billion people. It's a population that doubles every 25 years. So in 2050, one in four of the world population will be African. And that's why there's an African emergency. So to feed into this discussion, I want to talk about these. There are four key shocks that we're going through. The first shock is the shock that we're receiving from the rest of the world. So there's the Russo-Ukrainian war, which we've just talked about. We should know that with a particular ingredient for fertilizer. We went down to $800 for a ton, which is less than half the previous cost. So we can no longer subsidize this kind of product. So this is a significant shock which follows the pandemic, and it came before the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and with the whole impact on the Suez Canal, which has led to inflation. So there's inflation with Africa, which is imported inflation. The second shock that we're facing is climate change. We've got drought and flooding, which now makes it impossible to forecast African harvest, whereas African economies are primarily rural. The third shock that we're experiencing is a security shock. When I go to Burkina Faso, a country like Burkina Faso has lost about half of its territory because of the rise of jihadis. So we're talking about states that are not really states anymore, with all the implications that means in terms of the rolling out of public policies. In states like that, about a third of the population is internally displaced, with issues linked to education, which that creates in terms of repercussions. So around the security question, there is a fundamental issue. And the fourth shock that I observe are political shocks. Africa has unfortunately seen a rise in coups to the extent that we're thinking about what is the right way for societies to be led. There's a return to illiberal models, whereas in the 1990s we thought we'd got to the democratic model that could be rolled out everywhere, in particular in Africa. So these four African shocks, why am I talking about them? Because these are accelerators for the transitions that we've been observing for a number of years now. Demographic transition, fiscal transition, climate transition. And so the second part of what I want to say is, what could we do to move forward? What solutions can we find? The first one is macroeconomic regulation. I think the idea of the IMF to release 250 billion is a really excellent idea, but since it's on a pro rata of for each of the states of the IMF, Africa only gets 35 billion. So, and that really isn't enough. So I want to talk to this audience about the need for increased amounts in terms of these funds coming from the IMF. We need about 100 billion in Africa. The second solution beyond macroeconomic regulation is the question of protection in terms of agriculture. We need to understand that when a rice grower works in the United States, for example, when he works for an hour, he produces 400 times more than a Senegalese rice worker working for the equivalent amount of time. But he doesn't have 400 times more production. So he makes savings. So when you put them on the same market, the Senegalese worker disappears. So if he ends up in a liberal situation where he could travel, he should go to the Paris region. He should migrate to the Paris region. If we want to avoid that, we need to put in place a kind of protection so that Africa can develop its own agriculture. We've got 500 hectares of agricultural land. We've got 1 billion young people. There's no reason why Africa can't produce what it needs. The third potential solution, third and penultimate solution, is the question of whether we can actually live in our planet. So Africa represents 4% of greenhouse gases emissions for 17% of the world population. So that means if we were doing what everyone else did, we should produce 17% 17% of greenhouse gas effects. And if we include the opportunity for catching up, because other people have been destroying the planet for centuries, we ought to be authorized to produce over 17% of greenhouse gas emissions. But if we follow that reasoning, our planet will not be habitable anymore. So I want to call for a compensation so that Africa doesn't exploit its ecosystems. And my last point, which is really very important, I think, so we can take the applause out of my time for speaking. So the fourth and last point is state, society and territory, the connection between state, society and territory, which needs to be rebuilt. We were talking earlier with my colleagues, and I was saying to them, but what's going on in France right now is the dress rehearsal for what's going to be happening in the world in the years to come, is that those who've been forgotten by globalization are not going to accept dying silently. So if we don't put together state, territory and society again, we're going to hit some big trouble. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got 2 minutes left. Each of you, can you just say one word, a sentence in terms of your solution for connecting the worlds, relier les mondes? Let's start with Enrico. A very simple phrase, very simple sentence. In Europe, reconciling and connecting the worlds means acting. Inertia will mean that our fragmentation will take us to decline. And I can say this as a non-French citizen who loves this country. It's in your hands to make sure that action is positive for France and for Europe. Mia Patra.
Internal markets, I would say that has been good, and it is good if we are finding the strategically where we integrate, and then there is a lot to do on the local level. Comparison with the USA is taking very much time, but if you compare per capita, we are not lacking that much behind the change. But now we are seeing the trend that we don't want more people come from outside, and we don't want to take that will really, really be good for our economy. So this is a challenge, so we have to be quite much more brave.
Thank you. Pierre Doquez.
Pierre Doquez, just one sentence. One sentence only. A few years ago, a lot of years ago in China, there was a slogan that was important. It was the fourth modernization. The fourth modernization was democracy. So democracy as the fourth modernization, I think, is essential, and I think that needs to be shown. Reconciling, relier les mondes, bringing the world together, what would you do?
Countries, governments, and the people should have confidence in yourself.
Bravo.
Kaku, you've already spoken really very clearly, very strong words, but if you had another African proverb for us, that would be helpful. No, I've got no more African proverbs. But I call for rational solidarity. If we don't help Africa for ethical reasons, we need to help Africa to help itself so that our planet can be habitable. Philippe. I think rather than protectionism, we need innovation in all senses of the word. We need to have inclusive innovation. Everyone needs to take part in the innovation process. We've suffered in France with the fact that innovation has not been inclusive enough. There has been a vertical approach to power. I really believe in dialogue, parliamentary dialogue, social dialogue, and inclusivity. I think that's how we're going to overcome the populisms. Thank you very much. This was really excellent. Let's be innovative.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être présents pour cette nouvelle session aux rencontres économiques d'Aix-en-Provence. Si vis pacem, je vais y arriver, si vis pacem parabellum. Si tu veux la paix, prépare la guerre. Cette locution latine, elle aura rarement été autant d'actualité au XXIe siècle. 2022, vous vous en souvenez, a été l'année de l'offensive de la Russie sur l'Ukraine, conflit ouvert auquel peu croyaient avant que Vladimir Poutine donne l'ordre de lancer l'offensive. Tout le monde se souvient du 7 octobre 2023, jour de l'attaque terroriste du Hamas sur Israël, point de départ d'un conflit meurtrier qui ravage encore aujourd'hui la bande de Gaza. Et n'oublions pas les conflits larvés comme la menace que fait peser la Chine sur Taïwan. Alors ces conflits, qu'ils soient ouverts ou qu'ils ne soient que rampants, est-ce qu'ils ont un impact économique ? De quelle ampleur? Avec quel impact social également? La défense est-elle en train de redevenir une priorité économique?
An economic priority after decades of peace. I'd like to thank the speakers for helping us to understand all of those issues. Grégoire de Saint-Quentin, good morning to you. You are a former army general, and you are working for a private company. You are working for Preligens, started developing artificial intelligence for intelligence. David Edgerton, thanks a lot for being with us. You are an historian and a professor at the King's College, London. Stefan Lenden, former head of the Swedish government. Oh, Stefan is not with us. No, he's not with us. Okay. So, Tilman Ruff, thanks a lot for being with us. You are a doctor specializing in humanitarian help. So, you are part of an organization in order to abolish nuclear weapons, and you got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. We have Florence Parly, the former defense minister between 2017 and 2022. And of course, I would like to welcome Patrick Artus, a prominent member of the Cercle des Economistes. So first question for you, Patrick Artus. Big nations have to embark upon an unprecedented war effort. So when did we face such a situation, a kind of unprecedented situation, identical situation? Thanks a lot for giving me the floor. I will focus on 5 points, and then I will answer your question. So first point, of course, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, military spending was really colossal in the United States as well. But after the end of the Vietnam War, 8% of GDP in France, 3.5%, and in the world, 5%. And today, the figure is 3.3 for the US and 2.6 in the world. And it means that military spending has halved. And of course, it is connected with the end of communism. And of course, there wouldn't be any acute tensions or acute armed conflicts. So in the history, if you consider the level of military expenditure or spending, it was quite high in the past. But what about the nature of deterrence? If you consider deterrence, oh, by the way, after the end of the Vietnam War, there was no major international conflict at the time. So there was a twofold deterrence process, a nuclear and conventional deterrence. And the military expenditure was high for a conventional, for countries using conventional weapons and countries using the nuclear option. So we need to think about deterrence. If you consider France, and Europe, there should be a twofold type of deterrence. I mean, nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence, and this will shelter us from any aggression. And of course, we can be credible at the international level when it comes to our ability to defend ourselves. But there are some people who might not agree with me regarding the double deterrence approach. A third point, there's a significant question to raise: effect on productivity and economic activity. When you make a correlation between the level of military expenditure of the countries and growth in productivity, there is no link, there is no connection. So the countries with fewer military expenditure don't have more productivity gains than others. Two types of military expenditure: sophisticated military expenditure. For example, we develop some armament systems with drones and fighter jets. So it means that we need to invest in artificial intelligence, and it means that this type of military expenditure has some impact on productivity and corporate investments. And then you have military expenditure that is basic. For example, Russia produces millions of shells, and this has a negative impact on the economy, and people could produce more sophisticated products. So there is no link between productivity and military expenditure, because there are two types of military spending. A fourth point that I'd like to highlight: a country such as France. I will focus on France, but for France, there's a major challenge to take up. It's not possible to increase public spending without a solid industrial base. And unfortunately, we don't have any significant industrial base. The weight of industry in the French economy is 9%. It has stabilized over the years. It doesn't increase. We have very few people who want to embark upon a career in the industry sector. Only 10% of young people who follow engineers studies. We have 1,500 industrial SMEs as against 5,000 for the Germans. So it will be difficult to rebuild an armament industry and invest and spend more on military expenditure. And the industrial fabric of France is very flimsy, especially if you consider the people and the corporations or companies. And the fifth point, and this is my last point as part of this introduction, I think it's not time to increase military expenditure. The moment is not really relevant. I mean, of course, military expenditure will continue to rise in all countries. Military expenditure will rise. There are some estimates, independent estimates have been made. Europe will ensure its own defense with military budgets worth 3% of GDP, as against 2% of GDP today. Some significant efforts will have to be deployed in order to increase military expenditure at a time when we have to invest in energy transition, in education, in health, in the rest of the industry. So I think that some decisions will have to be made regarding military expenditure. And of course, it's Putin invaded Ukraine at a very bad moment, because we had to use public money that was required and productive. Recent work has shown that if the temperature of the planet rises by 1%, you will lose out in terms of the GDP to the tune of 12%. And of course, we need to invest in curbing climate change, in global warming. Of course, we have no choice but to increase our military expenditure, but the timing is really bad. I will hand over to Tilman Ruff. During the Cold War, there was a neutralization of the blocks because each bloc had the nuclear armament. Is it still the case today, this kind of status quo?
Unfortunately, yes. While happily the number of nuclear weapons has been reduced from a peak of over 70,000 in 1986, there are still over 12,000 in the hands of 9 nations with a growing danger of their use, and they are more than enough to dramatically pose the most acute existential threat that we face.
Pensez-vous qu'aujourd'hui,
Today, do you think that today the war in Ukraine, will trigger off a new humanitarian disaster?
Certainly already a humanitarian disaster, but it of course could get significantly worse if the nuclear threats that have repeatedly been made are borne out, and by inadvertence or unintended consequences, escalation in the fog of war and clouded decision-making, misinformation, it's quite possible that nuclear weapons might be used. If they are used, all of the evidence suggests that rapid, large-scale escalation will follow, and that would be a catastrophe for the world and not just Ukraine. In Ukraine, there's the additional nuclear factor that for the first time in an active war, we have had nuclear power plants essentially held hostage and used directly both to store weapons and shoot from, but also being fired at. That's a really profoundly dangerous situation because they contain very large amounts of long-lived radioactive material, and the consequences of a really major explosion or meltdown at a nuclear power plant could be larger and longer term in radiological consequences than even a large nuclear weapon. So this is a particular dimension to the Iran-Ukraine conflict. They could be disrupted by a conventional attack, by disruption to the cooling, water and the power supply that those facilities constantly need, as well as, of course, if they were targeted with nuclear weapons.
Ce qui signifie que plusieurs guerres s'entremêlent.
So it means that there are different wars that are intertwined in this conflict.
Indeed, and multiple, unfortunately, pathways for possible escalation.
David Edgerton,
David Edgerton, to get prepared for war, does it mean that war is inevitable?
What a question. This is the question we're here to address, and forgive me, I'm going to have to speak in English rather than in French. It's an embarrassment that we Anglo-Saxons have to bear. As Patrick so eloquently put it, in the years after 1945 into the 1980s, we had historically unprecedented levels of defense expenditure, and indeed historically unprecedented rates of economic growth, at least in the rich countries. And we had peace in Europe. Of course, we didn't have peace in Korea, we didn't have peace in Vietnam, we didn't have peace in Africa. And indeed, millions and millions of people lost their lives in what was a very hot war in many parts of the world. But certainly the idea that deterrence worked, both conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence worked, became firmly established. There was a powerful consensus in favor of high levels of defense expenditure. And the United Kingdom, even higher than France, around 10% in the early 1950s, down to about 5% in the 1970s and 1980s. But if we want to look further back in history, the picture and the arguments look rather different. It was a commonplace in the interwar years to say that the First World War, the Great European War, was caused by an arms race between the great powers. And indeed, that was a powerful argument. Defense expenditures, though very much lower than in the 1950s or 1960s, were increasing. new kinds of weapons were being developed, notably naval weapons and what we now would think of as modern artillery. Societies were militarizing themselves in the sense of increasing conscription, military service. And culturally, they were militarizing themselves as well. So there was a general preparation for war, which indeed led to war. War was not deterred, it was encouraged. So we need to be very aware of that precedent. It's I think, a very important one. Now, why might war be encouraged? Well, in part, it's to do with the dynamics of arms races. So there's an argument that Germany went to war in 1914 because it was a moment of advantage, and it could see that it would be in a less favorable position a few years down the line. So arms races can create dynamics that lead people to take risks and to start wars. What about the interwar years themselves? Here, our post-1945 story is very, very different. The story here is that Adolf Hitler rearmed, the Nazis rearmed, and the rest of the world didn't realize the threat. And that had they realized early enough there was a threat from Adolf Hitler, they would have rearmed and they would have stopped the war. So Winston Churchill spoke of the unnecessary war. And that's a very powerful argument that, of course, was part of the reason, I think, we had high levels of defense expenditure after the war. We do not want another Munich. We do not want another Hitler. However, if one looks at the 1930s, what we see is an arms race. Every country was rearming in the 1930s. The Soviet Union was rearming, France was rearming, United Kingdom was rearming, Japan was rearming, China was rearming, and so indeed was the United Kingdom. So one could argue that there were arms race dynamics in the 1930s, and indeed that Adolf Hitler in 1939 and 1940 took advantage of a position where he knew he was relatively strong but will become much weaker. So the story is a complicated one, and there are many contradictory lessons to be learned from history.
Je vous en prie, allez-y, vous pouvez. Je vais donner la parole à Florence.
I will hand over to Florence Parly, a Minister of Defense between 2017 and 2022. So we're under the impression that the Western camp rested on its laurel because of a peace that was too long and it was not ready to be prepared with a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. How we've lost a part of our sovereignty regarding this dream for peace. So as Patrick said, in the 1970s, the Europeans invested 3 or 4% of GDP, and before the start of a war between Russia and Ukraine, it was 1% or 1.5%. So military expenditure was halved. They called that the peace dividends. We hoped that these peace dividends, were invested in public policies, and from time to time, we would have liked to be more ambitious, but we have to wake up to the fact that if you consider the decisions that are being made, the decisions can't be made as though we were in a peaceful environment. We would like to do more in energy transition, of course, but we have a duty as well. We don't want the French people to learn Russian as a first language at school. It might be good, but if they are obliged to do so, it's not a good thing. It's a good thing when it's a choice. Please, please. You will have the opportunity to ask questions. Don't interrupt me, please. So there is no such thing as peace without security, no economic development without security. So security is a key element, a key dimension. So there is no freedom without security. So all of these dimensions are bound together. So if you consider 1,000 euros worth of public spending in France, 491 for social protection, 159 for health, 89 for education, and 30 for defense. So even though we are absurd to unleash 30 euros out of 1,000 in order not to invest in defense, it means that you don't have much considerable budget leeway. So for us, when you are faced with Mr. Putin, it's of pivotal importance, to deter him from invading Ukraine fully, if this is their project, and we should prevent Putin from doing bad things. And in Europe, there's a lot of rearmament, and in Eastern Europe, the growth of military expenditure is quite high, 13% in Europe and 50% in Eastern Europe, because some countries such as Poland, Estonia, they feel threatened by what is happening in Ukraine. So allow me to end my comment. Of course, it is important to get a powerful industry in order to deter potential adversaries or rivals who could threaten us. In terms of threats, allow me to remind you of an element, a risk of a NATO country being invaded, the risk of a European country being invaded, but every day we are under attack. There are lots of cyber attacks on a daily basis. These cyber attacks are not conspicuous, but this is a tangible element regarding the Star Wars. Star Wars, there are wars. The military or civil satellites are under threat by different unfriendly satellites that will destroy them, that will deteriorate them or divert them. So, in fact, we can't only talk about risks. There are risks that are tangible, that have materialized. So in order to deter, in order to use deterrence, it's important, to be equipped with a powerful industry. So in France, for example, at the end of the day, we have two contradictory dimensions. A first dimension described by Patrick, there's a lack of industrialization. It has been the case for the past 30 or 40 years, but there's nonetheless a piece of good news. There's a field in which we haven't curtailed our investments, i.e. defense industries. Of course, over the past 10 years, we've done many things. The defense industries, because of their presence, they have a fundamental economic usefulness for jobs, and in terms of technologies, you have military technologies and civil technologies alike. Allow me to develop this point, but basically I've overshot my speaking time, so I'm sorry about that. But we will give the floor to Grégoire de Saint-Quentin now. So, General. So you are a retired general. The Russia of Vladimir Putin is eager to get an East-West confrontation, as it was the case during the Cold War. Does it mean that the blocs haven't evolved in 50 years? Answer: it will be a tragic error to get that approach. Of course, it is being said that we have this kind of music coming from Moscow. So NATO has supposedly encircled the country, according to the Russians. So on TV, you can see battles of tanks, you can see trenches, you can see artillery pieces or artillery weapons. It is reminiscent of the confrontation during the First and Second World Wars. So back to the future, so to speak. So we are back to something that we were familiar with. So it is no longer the USSR, now you have Russia, on the other hand, you have NATO, and that's a fundamental mistake. And in fact, there's a kind of trap that is being laid. For example, on the one hand, you will have the Westerners. So you mean the trap being set by Russia, and then, on the other hand, all the other countries that have been subjected to war. So who wants to get the peace needs to get prepared for the war, but we need to get prepared for the war of tomorrow. But the war of tomorrow is different to the war of the past. Yes, the configuration of a war is different from a strategic viewpoint. All of the treaties designed to limit weapons haven't really materialized. Of course, I mean, there were some expeditionary wars. So, of course, there will be new risks in the future, and the strategic architecture crumbled. And there's something that crumbled recently. So the treaty on intermediate range weapons, nuclear or conventional weapons that can hit within a radius of 500 or 2,000 kilometers. So this treaty doesn't exist anymore because the United States considered that this treaty was violated by the Russians, and in fact, they wanted to get a balanced military system. So you need to consider the nuclear balance. So it means that we need to think about our stance. We need to focus maybe on conventional weapons. So, Mr. Artus, of course, a nuclear deterrence is required and indispensable. It is the linchpin of our strategic architecture. We need to think about the treaties that have crumbled, and we need to use conventional deterrence in order to control this escalation of a war entrepreneur. So before we have a Q&A session, so regarding the nuclear industry, there's a paradigm shift, you've said, Tillman. Do you agree with what has been said by General de Saint-Quentin?
I think nuclear deterrence is a really fundamentally flawed and problematic fig leaf that has been widely used to justify the continued possession, build-up, threat of use of the most inhumane, indiscriminate weapons ever invented.
Alors, avant de vous faire réagir.
So before I get any further reaction from people here, I want to hear whether there are some things that you would like to add or comment on or critique on what's been said. Patrick, first of all. We can see that there are two debates going on here. Firstly, should increased military spending necessarily lead to conflict? As my neighbour reminded us, history is rather contradictory in this light. Of course, the Great War of 1914 and the Second World War in 1939 was driven perhaps by arms races, but particularly by the belief in Germany that there was a temporary advantage that it held over other countries. So you could say that to arm oneself is dangerous because it will lead to war, because it makes people want to use the arms. But you could also interpret history by saying it's important not to get behind those countries that are arming. So the problem there is that you get countries outbidding one another, and there's a lot of arms spending because each country will respond to the other countries by buying more and more arms. So my response would be to say, if this is the outlook, if Europe does need to spend 3 to 4% of its GDP on arms, do we not need to completely change our economic rules? Is this compatible with our European economic policy rules, with levels of public debt, with price stability rules, or should we accept that because there is a need to spend more on the military expenditure and all the other spending that we're going to need to add in? If we add in the different transitions, we think that additional investment will be around 5 points of GDP. If you need an extra 3% of GDP of military spending on top of that, that's another 7 or 8% altogether. So should we not say that this is no longer compatible with maintaining the usual economic rules that apply in Europe, for example? Comment from General Saint-Quentin. Just going back to the first point rather than the economic point, I think that if there was a time during the Cold War where there was disarmament treaties, it's because both parties realized that they were in a stupid arms race and that it was better to agree to reduce the military and economic pressure on their own economies. And we tend to say that the Cold War was won on an economic and technological level because at a particular time the USSR realized that it could no longer follow the pace of American development in technology and in terms of R&D investment. So what we need to remind ourselves is that when NATO says that the rule is a minimum of 2% investment in 2% of GDP to be invested in military spending in the defense, there is a decimal point there. It's including 20% of defense investment. So it's not about having big armies with very big battalions that are poorly equipped. NATO is saying that you need to spend on equipping the armies, otherwise you're not credible. And currently, I would say very honestly, we need to make a leap forward. I'm not sure that in terms of ensuring deterrence, the title of the session is Who Wants Peace Prepares for War. I'm not sure that we need to invest massive sums to create a hyperinflation in military spending. I'm not sure that Russia has it has a certain level of strategic depth, but I'm not sure that it has enough economic depth. It doesn't have an infinite economic depth because the war in Ukraine is wearing the country down. So I don't think we need to necessarily do a lot to show the determination through the political decisions they'll be taking and through material and a moral rearmament to send a message to say, don't even think it. And that's what I wanted to say. A quick response from Florence Parly. Yes, I just wanted to say that this isn't something that is laid down by law. We can't switch from a system, a peacetime economy to a wartime economy by overnight. I can tell you that over the 5 years when I was in charge, it was difficult to talk between Europe about the concept that is now clear, given the current context, this concept of strategic autonomy. It wasn't an argument that could be heard because no one understood that one day, perhaps, the Americans might have other interests, interests that diverge from the Europeans. There are two examples. In 2018, President Trump was threatening NATO countries at the NATO summit by saying, if you don't pay up, we will do our own thing. So what he said is, you'll have to make do without us. And more recently, he said it in an even more explicit manner. So we need to shift from a mentality where NATO is the absolute security umbrella for the Europeans to a mindset where Europeans need to take a greater role in ensuring their own security. It's taken a very long time. We're very pleased to have the European facility, which enabled us to make a response at the time of the Ukrainian war. It was put in place with a view to conflicts in Africa, but it enabled us to buy arms for Ukraine, and it happened just before war broke out in Ukraine. We need to move forward, accelerate. We know that Europeans want to do this, but things always take longer. We're talking about sharing resources, pooling finance. Thierry Breton is talking about a 100 billion euro fund for defence in Europe. We've managed to borrow money in the name of the European Union for the post-COVID reconstruction period. But there are a bunch of other questions that we need to think about, and we need to think about it further. David Edgerton. Are European countries not giving themselves the means necessary?
Russia has the GDP of Italy. So all European countries together spending a trivial proportion of GDP could counter Russia without any difficulty at all. Now, of course, if we feel that we're in a real emergency, all the conventional arguments we have about public debt and this, that, and the other go out of the window, as they have done in the past. We haven't run any major war using conventional economics, and we need to remember that. But I'd just like to make one other point. Our military colleague described the war in Ukraine as Back to the Future.
Ex-military.
Ex-military. My apologies. And that's right. And there's a very interesting tension, I think, between preparing for the next war and preparing for the last war. And I think in public discourse, we are perhaps prone to preparing for a future war of our imaginations, and not enough to preparing for the last war. And this is very evident, actually, in the case of British history, in that in the First World War, it was preparing for a war of battleships rather than a war on land with soldiers. And in the Second World War, was preparing for a war of bombers, not a war of tanks, or not a war of, again, infantry. So we have to be very cautious when we hear people saying that the armies are preparing for the last war, and that's a condemnatory statement. And we also need to be very cautious about those people who claim that in the future war will be radically different and won't involve the military, for example. It'll just involve a bunch of cyber nerds doing their thing. So these, again, are complicated questions, and history, again, gives us contradictory answers.
Comme ces rencontres sont aussi les vôtres, je vous propose de...
These meetings are for you as well, so let's take a time of questions that you might want to ask our speakers. There's a question here on the left-hand side. Could you do it in a calm way and remain in the debate? We won't be able to translate if the speaker doesn't use a microphone, of course. Please wait for the microphone, sir. I do apologize for having spoken out earlier. I want to say I lived in Ukraine for 10 years, 2006 to 2015. I saw the coup d'etat in Kiev. I saw 150 policemen killed on the public square without anyone doing anything about it. After a bit of research, I realized that part of Macron's team was involved in this coup d'etat. It's in the book that I've written. Have you got a question to ask, sir? Do you have a question to ask, sir? Could you ask your question? Do you agree with the coup d'etat of the Maidan Square, which led to butchery over the last 10 years? I am a witness of this. Whether we talk about Mariupol or otherwise. Thank you. Let's hear from Florence Parly on this subject. I don't think I will be able to convince you, But no one in the president's team ever imagined fomenting a riot or an uprising in Ukraine. The merit of our democracy is to discuss questions of war and adversity with our own values, and that is what it makes it important to anticipate future wars, and it's very difficult to do so, actually. I think that democracy cannot be defended in the same way as an autocracy. We can see it very clearly in questions such as disinformation. Combating disinformation has a certain limits and boundary in countries like our own. It requires us not to spread false information. So we're in an asymmetric situation. We need to talk about that and be proud of it. No, I'm sorry, sir. You've asked your question, and I would like you to not take this panel hostage. Thank you. Microphone, please. Madam.
Ruth, what in the current state of the world, what would you dream of? What would be the action that would be for you the best to lead us towards peace?
I think we're in a really dangerous time when the number of conflicts in the world, the number of people being killed in them, is at unprecedented levels since 1946. We have this confluence of really major crises for humanity: global heating, the continued and escalating danger of nuclear war, crises of nature and biodiversity, of pandemics, and many other issues that we share on this small, fragile, interconnected planet. The most urgent need that I see as a public health physician to secure the future of a peaceful and healthy world is to eliminate the only weapons that can destroy that world in an afternoon. That takes 9 states to fulfill their obligations. We have successfully implemented on time, in a verified way, in the past, treaties that have reduced the number of nuclear weapons and eliminated whole classes of them, in the case of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that Grégoire mentioned. So we know how to do this. That's the most urgent need. And at present, unfortunately, none of the 9 nuclear-armed states are serious about fulfilling that obligation. Where there is lack of leadership, it needs popular pressure, and that needs all of us to secure a future for us and for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Monsieur.
Pensez-vous que la jeunesse...
Do you think that today's European youth is ready to prepare for war in order to obtain peace? Who wants to answer that question? General? First of all, I'm not sure that I represent youth in the room, and maybe a younger person than me would like to take the floor and speak. We're very lucky to have a number of young people here under this marquee. Two things come to mind for me. Firstly, I work for a startup in the defense industry. I see a number of people who take an interest in these subjects, and a lot more so than I saw in people of my generation. And I can see that in many university curricula which discuss international policy and defense policy, we're seeing increasing numbers of applicants, whether that's in Sciences Po type courses or elsewhere. It shows that young people are interested in security issues, and that's a very good thing. They need to get hold of this issue. It's an issue that's as relevant to them as it is to us. But once again, I think we need to make sure that we don't look as we have done in the past at these issues, but we need to understand what young people are thinking about these issues. They need to get hold of the subjects. They've got things to contribute. It's not just about experience in this field. There are new ways of approaching some of these questions. The second idea that comes to mind is that, and I'm sure this is what's behind your question, the thing that is coming back today is that we need to accept the reality of the battle. Accepting the battle means, in my view, being able to fight until the adversary surrenders and gives in. And thank God we're very blessed to have lived over the last 30 years without having to think about these questions. But when I look at the war in Ukraine, even from a tactical point of view, when I think about the material and human resources that the two warring parties are throwing into the combat in order to gain a few square kilometers, you will understand that it's not about the square miles. It's about whether you're going to surrender, whether you're going to collapse, whether you're going to give in. No one thought that the 24th of February 2022, that the war would be continuing today with such an intensity. So I don't know if we're prepared for this. But in any case, we need to think that in the future, we might need to go back to being ready for such phases of combat. Over the last 30 years, we've been involved in some state-to-state conflicts, but that were often very asymmetric. Some people talk about chosen conflicts. I don't think France, Europe, or NATO particularly chose to go to war in Afghanistan. I think we were forced into it to a certain extent. Sorry, I can't hear what's not in the microphone. The question is not about the war aims. I'm talking about the sacrifice here. We agreed to these wars, but the Ukrainians are victims. They're suffering a war that is imposed upon them. So if war is a continuation of politics by other means, we can see that imposing one's will on the adversary and the ability to withstand and resist is going to be a critical issue. So the spirit of sacrifice and the moral strength in that is going to be very important. Florence Parly, you wanted to say something? I think that Grégoire de Saint-Quentin is absolutely right. No one knows when facing adverse circumstances how one will react, but we need to understand that defense is an issue for the whole nation. And I want to just go back to issues around industrial production here, because the capability to carry out this combat of wills requires means. I'm not saying that we need to go back to an infant arms race, but we do need some capabilities. Some very good things were said about the complementarity between nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence, but we need, in the future, engineers, technicians. We need training and education to raise up people to work in these industries, and it's been very difficult to point our young people in those directions up until now. So I think each of us have a role to play, a combat to carry out in our old areas in order to knock down preconceptions which say that scientific studies are not about this. We need to combat the ideas of saying that there's a glass ceiling for women, because we can't do without 50% of humanity in science and technology. It's not just a question of money, it's a question of preparedness. It's about operational readiness, as the military people would say. Our country needs to be ready to support and carry a major effort over a long duration. That's what the situation in Ukraine is showing us. That doesn't mean that we just need to focus on producing shells and munitions. We will need them, of course, but alongside that, we need to continue to think about what tomorrow's conflicts might look like. It's not an easy thing to do, but it will require us to invest significantly in research and development, and that's what armed forces contribute to. 25% of French R&D comes in from the defense sector. We need to remember that thanks to nuclear deterrence, we've been able to maintain these defense industries. If we didn't have nuclear deterrence, we would have dropped our guard and reduced investment. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Minister. Following on from what you said about the defense industry, I want to know your opinion about the emergence of defense champions on a European level. We've got a fairly fragmented market and we're not able to scale up production for the Ukrainians. What's your opinion on this issue? Do we need to build large European champions in the defense industry? You've got 1 minute and 15 seconds. Firstly, we need to build security of supply in a number of areas, and not only in the defense industry. COVID showed us that, but we also need to build it up in defense industries alongside that. We need to reduce our dependency on some partners. That doesn't mean that we won't remain allies. I'm not going to repeat what I said earlier. And once again, we need to make sure as Europeans that we are not competing in export markets with one another. That will require some hard work, difficult work actually, which involves consolidation. But I do want to note this is going on. KNDS was only just starting out and it's now taking form since the Ukraine conflict. Final word from Patrick Artus, maybe? 1 minute, please. Yes, very, very quickly. Yes, I think that we need to dream up a model where the private sector benefits from the military effort. Everyone talks about the US DARPA model. We need a European DARPA to ensure that there is true synergy between technical progress in the private sector and technical progress in the military sector. A second point, we need to make sure that we don't limit the costs of military conflict to the military area. Cyber defense costs are major costs for private enterprises. There are costs in repairing underwater cables, undersea cables. So we're already in a situation which is a conflict, which goes well beyond the strict military framework. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all that you said. Just a final word from me to highlight that Patrick Artus, who's here, will be signing his book. His book is called Quelle France pour 2050? France for 2050. So you can meet him at 4:30 at the Fnac bookshop in this park. Thank you very much to everyone for listening.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning to all of you. So please take a seat. We will start very shortly our discussion. Thanks a lot. It's always a great pleasure to welcome you here today, to talk with you, to discuss with you in this tent as part of the Rencontre économique de Aix-en-Provence. For this session, we are delighted to welcome Jacques Attali, the president of Attali Associates and Positive, and Alexis Tsipras, the former Greek prime minister. We will be talking about a thrilling topic, a topical issue. How can we reconcile politicians and economists? It's a broad topic, some would say. And I will ask you the same question that will be the thread of our discussions. Why? Why there's a lack of understanding? We could even say that there are some disputes between the economic world and political circles, and it has always been the case. Alexis Tsipras, what is your take on that? What is your viewpoint, this lack of understanding between the two worlds?
So please take your headphones.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and I will answer your question immediately.
Alors, en attendant que vous ayez tous un petit traducteur pour comprendre.
So while you grab the headsets, so that you can understand this language, this nice language, we will listen to Mr. Attali. It's very difficult to speak when you have some people who are popping in and popping out. But why economists and politicians do not agree, why they don't see eye to eye. They have something that they all share, i.e., whatever the opinion on any topic, I will find a politician who see eye to eye with a point. So politics and economics are not sciences. None of them. But if you consider history and geography, these are sciences. So we need to move away from this myth whereby you have people who are subjective, i.e. the politicians, and people who are serious, who are wise, who are politicians. Of course, you have experimental science, hard science. So I'm stating the obvious, but science is not in the economic field, and economics is not a science. But you need to take into account the economic reality, and there are some constraints upon the politicians. You have the constraints of dearth, in fact. You have to consider the limits of demographics, geopolitics. You have to consider the different contexts. In a given context, politicians don't have the same room for maneuver in terms of freedom that he or she could hope for. So there's a dangerous common point between the two. Very often, economics is based on the short term, the markets that will take actions according to the short term, and the politicians will take actions taking into account the polls and the elections that will take place on Sunday, the second round of the elections. And there is something that is pivotal today. How can we give the right to vote for the future generations? This is a matter for politicians and for the economists. How can they make sure that their actions are based upon the long term? So two questions have to be raised. Are there any people who have done better? And if I take a decision, what will be the impact in 30 years' time? So we need to raise those two issues from an economic viewpoint and from a political viewpoint. And politicians and economists, focus on the short term. So Jacques Attali, you've described the situation. Alexis Tsipras, what do you think of this misunderstanding, and maybe how can we remedy that situation, the lack of understanding between politicians and economists? Oscar Wilde once said that technocrats know everything about prices, but nothing about values. So economists, technocrats, they are knowledgeable about the price of things, but they don't consider the genuine value of things. When I talk about value, the value of democracy, the value of common goods, social justice, morality in politics, the value of solidarity. So I'm convinced that, of course, it is of critical importance to get technocrats, economists with us. But at the same time, we can't have a policy that is based on technocrats' views and economists' diktats. There's another criterion that is pivotal regarding our actions and the way the actions are shaped. It's very difficult to make a distinction between politicians and economists. You've talked about disputes, lack of understanding. It's a wrong distinction. I think that politicians need to get a vision, but at the same time, politicians need to understand the short, mid, and long term of policies. Stability is key. So economy is everything. So if I were to paraphrase Keynes, you have some politicians who think that they shouldn't listen to the economists. These politicians are people who are implementing obsolete economic theories. We have politicians and economists, and they focus on the short term. They want to be popular, and they look at the polls, and they tell what the people are ready to listen. So we have the big financial groups, and we have politicians with a vision. They think about the common good. You have some economists who don't look at the short-term interests. So it's important to get a kind of situation whereby common goods could be above our short-term interests. Cooperation between politicians and economists. Do you agree with that, Jacques Attali? There are people who do not focus on the long term, and they've realized their limitations. When you're a politician, when you are an economist, you have some limitations. As Alexis Tsipras said, we could reconcile politicians and economists' answer. If you consider the political action, there are some constraints that need to be taken into account. As I said, and as Alexis pointed out, you have physical constraints, material constraints, not only economic constraints. There are some political constraints. When you are in a democracy, you are accountable to the people, so you can't do anything. Very often I turn to economists, to take a decision for a president of the Republic. So we brought together the top 12 French economists with 12 contradictory statements. So far, I've qualified the validity of economists. But is it healthy to have 12 different viewpoints? Yes, it is quite healthy. There's no such thing as an all-encompassing truth. So economists will provide you with some insights into the concepts mentioned by Alexis. Public, private goods, the law of the market, general services. These are concepts that have been formalized for the past 2 centuries according to the different economic theories. Economic theories play a key role in terms of political decision-making. Today, what is at stake is the debate between market, democracy, and dictatorship. So if you consider the market, so the market prevailed in order to distribute private goods. So for the distribution of private goods, the market rules the roost. But for the distribution of public goods, some economists will think that the market is better, everything should be privatized. And there is no clear border. That's why politics plays a key role to set the boundaries between public goods and private goods. What could be a public service that is free of charge, being paid by taxes, and what should be paid by consumers, even though you can offset the process with taxes and subsidies. So this is a political issue. What is the common good? What is the private good? Once this decision has been made, economists play a key role to deliver a message to politicians. There are some external constraints to take into account, but at the same time, they cannot impose too many things. The economists played an excessive role during the European construction. For example, they collided with politicians, or they colluded with politicians. Competition was key for them. So why did they collude with politicians? Any voter is a consumer, above all, but only 1/3 of the voters are workers. So consumers and voters, they vote against workers. And if you consider the European construction, it was shaped in favor of consumers at the expense of voters. And when competition was considered to be a benefit, lots of people feel good about it. And in fact, Europe is an open field at a global scale. So bear witness the Henri Paoletta report, but you have the competition-based economy and the prevalence of the consumer, of the voter, was a disaster. Before I hand over to you, of course, I would like you to take part in this discussion. Lots of things have been said by Jacques Attali, Mr. Tsipras. For example, the involvement and role of the market. If you consider the combination of politicians and economists, so what is the role of the market, in fact?
I think that we all know what the role of the market is, what the markets want. Markets want to make ever greater levels of profits. We're talking about bodies that are profit-making organizations. That's the role of the market. Their role is to earn more and more money, earn as much money as possible by any means possible, with very often a very significant political and social cost. My question is rather to say, what is the role of politics? What's the role of politicians? How can we create a counterweight, counterbalance to avoid attacking democracy? I understand today that politics has changed. The time of François Mitterrand was so different to ours. France's policy was so different to what is possible today. But orthodox financial reasoning that says that markets are always right is not always right. The Liz Truss experiments in the UK, well, in that case, we can say that the markets were right. They played an important role. But in 1983, with the French franc, the markets weren't right. And in the case of the Greek debt crisis, the markets were wrong. They wanted an analysis which looked at the German economy and the Greek economy in the same light, on the same level. They were wrong. They played a game of poker and they got it wrong. And that's why I think that politicians need to create a counterweight. Quantitative easing may be a kind of counterweight. It can sometimes combat the negative effects of the market. I think we need to take into account macroeconomic data, and in order to do so, we need to ensure that we have policies that create wealth. This is the second important point. Wealth needs to be distributed in a fair way with fair taxation. In order to do so, we need to combat and confront the powerful interests in our countries. That's why we cannot say that the right wing and the left wing are the same thing. We can't say that all politicians are the same. We need to create wealth and ensure fair redistribution. The taxation system needs to be fair, and I would repeat what I say. We need to be ready to confront the major interests in our nations. We need to be sure that we are ready for this confrontation. We can't always be the kind and nice person. Thank you very much. Your message has been very clear, Alexis Tsipras. So we're now going to hand over to people on the floor. There are some microphones around. So please raise your hand and ask a question. We've got about 5 minutes for questions and answers. 5 minutes for you. If you don't have any questions, I got some. We are talking about economists, but are we generalizing things too much? My question is for Mr. Attali. Are there not some economists that are too close to the interests of large firms? They don't produce economic discourse, but a discourse that's in the interest of certain people, certain interests. Yes, that's what I was saying earlier. There's always an economist to defend every type of opinion, because there are all sorts of opinions. I won't say that an economist who's working within a particular company has lost his or her freedom of expression. We're confusing two issues here. The supposed position between economists and politicians, and the different position between the economist and the market. Politics is one thing, but the market is a reality. There is a challenge when an economist wants to combat the market. An economist might be able to do it if he is powerful. To be powerful, he will need to be rich. So that's why, by its very nature, the European construction seeks to go beyond the constraints of the markets, and I think we have made some progress in this direction. If we want to go beyond the constraints of the market, history tells us that we need to be either very small, like Singapore, or very big, like USA, China, Russia, and maybe one day Europe. This is a big discussion between market and the state, and we need to distinguish here between democracies and dictatorships. So there are economists who are used in different ways. They have ideological biases. Each one of us, whether we're historians, geographers, or sociologists, whatever we are, we need to have a critical way of thinking. Thank you, Jack Attali. My name is Josh Rosenberg. I've got a question that comes back from a previous panel in room number 2. It talked about Europe, which is an economic, budgetary, a fiscal dwarf. So, two questions. What did we miss in building Europe in the 1970s and 1980? And with what's going on Sunday, is there anything that will enable Europe to emerge as a continent that's able to combat China and the USA? First of all, two very obvious answers. In Europe, we're doing something that's only been achieved once successfully, that is to build a country from bottom up. Generally, countries are built top down. You have a dictator, a conqueror that brings territories together. France was brought together by a conqueror. And Europe, we have a lot of nations that have dreamed of being the emperors of the world for a while, and sometimes they were the emperors. With Europe, we're trying to build differently, bottom up, and the only example that has worked in this way is Switzerland, which has built a bottom up, but they took 4 centuries to do so. Why did they do that? Because they were afraid of an emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor in the German states, and they built in that way for this reason. But we don't have this time. We have competitors, enemies even, that are trying to pillage the richest areas of the world. The USA, China, Russia are trying to pillage and loot in our territories, and that's why this discussion is not economic. The question is, will we be afraid enough of our decline in order to build a European political entity that will withstand? And that requires something right now that is not economic. It requires a European army. Why haven't we done this? I'm old enough to have been around at the start of the construction of the European Monetary Union. We started with a Franco-German brigade, and we hoped that in the end of the 1980s it would lead to a European army. 40 years later, there's still not been one. Why? Because the American ally has been influencing things to ensure that political and most of all a military Europe has not been built. It's against their interest, in my view, because it would be in their interest to have a true power in Europe. But I nonetheless remain relatively optimistic, because I think we're starting to understand this very simple sentence. We are on our own. When you're on your own in life or in public life, you have to react. Alexis Tsipras, a final word on Europe. We've gone well beyond the initial framework of the debate, but could you tell us a little bit about Europe? The question from the floor was very interesting in this regard. First of all, I would like to say that Europe has achieved something that's very important. For decades, almost to 70 years, we've lived in prosperity and in peace. Right now, we're in the throes of a very significant crisis, and we will need to change our approach, first of all, by deepening our political union, and secondly, by ensuring military autonomy. We live in a multipolar world, a very complex world, and in such a world we need to ensure strategic autonomy. Sometimes our interests are the same as those of the USA, but sometimes it's not the case. When we have different interests from those of the USA, we need to be able to defend those interests. Our interests need to be founded on our major European values: peace, democracy, liberty, and justice. And that's why I believe that at various levels we are going to need to rethink what the right approach to history should be. What's history? Which story are we going to choose? How can we play a role in the world's conflicts? Social justice and democracy are important. We need to ensure we reduce inequality within our European Union countries, but also the inequalities between member countries, because this is what is strengthening the far right. The far right is a threat to us, and it may lead to Europe being destabilized and jeopardizing Europe's futures. This is a real danger. Thank you. Perhaps that's a subject that will bring politicians and economists together. Thank you very much to both of you. Before I let you go, I want to just say that Jacques Attali will be signing his book at 12:30 at the Fnac bookshop in Parc Jourdan. So that's going to be in just a few minutes' time if you want to go and get a signature. Thank you very much for everyone for attending this discussion. See you soon.